Hi everybody, welcome to another video. So today I'm going to be talking to you about disability representations in specific film genres. I remember doing this as an article about 4 or 5 years ago, and the reason why I'm doing this video I think is because I want to kind of translate what I said in that article onto the screen, so there'll be more videos like this in the future. So like most social groups in films, they've been represented in very diverse ways, from very stereotypical horror representations to the triumph over tragedy melodramas. And I feel that in the world of film and television, that disability is represented as almost like a metaphor through certain imagery, and also the other one where disability is directly involved as part of the story. It's like a plot device where it's directly involved within the narrative. So for example, a film about a man with disabilities could be represented as like an abject gaze, sort of disgust almost, within a horror story where they become a villain, whereas a film about Stephen Hawking or someone like him could be represented as someone who has had struggles with their disability while also having that sense of triumph, of something to focus on, to kind of go over that board, almost like as a source that raises awareness. So the purpose of this video is to go through each genre. So I'm going to go through action and adventure, animation, comedy, drama, horror, romance, science fiction, war, and western. So those are the 9 genres that I'm going to be going through and looking at specific examples of how disability is represented within those specific film genres. So without further ado, let's get started.
Me or everyone else.
So action and adventure. I feel this particular genre overlaps with various different ones really, where you have different subgenres of action sci-fi, action horror, action comedy, those kind of things, but within the actual genre conventions of action cinema, I feel as though disability in action is something that can be a sense of loss, or like, a loss of limb from a certain situation within an action scene, or almost as a sense of power that goes beyond what the normal average human being can do, but also something that you can kind of infuse to use as a tool. So for example, in Mad Max Fury Road by George Miller, the 4th installment in the Mad Max series, Furiosa, played by Charlize Theron, she's a character who has clear physical disabilities where she only has one arm. So the rest of her arm is prosthetic, where she kind of uses that as a sense of power, in a particular sequence where she fights the title character Max. So she uses that sense of loss from not having her rest of her arm as something that she can use as a sense of force. Her having that prosthetic arm shows a sense of identity where it's part of who she is. Like anything really. Like my glasses, they're a form of my identity, or people who have braces in their teeth, or people who have hearing aids as well, things like that. And I feel that Furiosa in Mad Max Fury Road is a good example of how to do that, but with an action-like context.
Remember me?
She uses that and becomes a badass, she becomes someone who's very powerful, and also because she strikes some kind of feminine power in a film where there's a lot of men, a lot of males who are very, very dominant and very, very fierce. So I think she kind of establishes that sense of feminine authority. That's a real defining aspect of that particular character. I think other characters in Mad Max Fury Road establish that sense of disability as well. Like Morton Joe, the primary antagonist, he wears a mask that's like an oxygen tank almost, where it's got some teeth. It's a sense of deformity, but at the same time, because he has the teeth on there, it reasserts that sense of identity, that he kind of feels that that's part of his mouth, and because he has all the chains and everything, along with the mask, it almost does represent a sense of disgust. How I see it, the genre uses disability one or two ways. The first way, where the characters are evil with a disability that they use as a sense of power, whereas with Furiosa, she uses that loss of her arm and demonstrates that sense of power back within the action against those characters. That's what I think of genre. I think it's an interesting aspect of genre. So let's move on to the next one. I feel that animation stands out differently than every other one because, obviously, with animation, you actually create. As animation, most of the time, is primarily made for kids, that disability is used as a metaphor within the story, or sometimes directly as part of that narrative, in which kids can learn from that, where it kind of conveys a message. I just feel with animation, and Disney in this case with disability, that it does represent that. But I feel with Disney animation that disability is represented as a metaphor for the villain, but as a subject, the hero. So I'm going to look at a few examples. So Peter Pan in 1953. I'm particularly going to talk about the character of Captain Hook in this one because he has a hand with a hook on. We learn why he doesn't have that, because he wants revenge
That Peter Pan
for losing his hand, and that's why the crocodile's after him, because he's eaten the hand and he wants more from Hook. He wants to eat him, basically. You could look at it one way, where you feel sorry for Captain Hook because he lost his hand, but at the same time the film makes him look like the villain.
Are you blithering blockhead?
And Peter Pan the hero, therefore make him the villain as the abject who's disabled and deformed. It shows that in his personality. He actually physically uses it, like how one still would a hand. He uses it as a weapon when he uses it to lash out at Peter Pan. So it's like how one would use a sword as well, but it's just actually attached to his hand. I think even the reference of him being called a codfish is quite interesting as well, because the crocodile's after him and it's almost like a fish on a hook.
Well, a codfish on a hook.
That kind of reference dehumanises him as not just as a character, but as a character with some kind of disability. Therefore, I feel that the hook is used as a sense of identity, not just on his body, but also in his name. So that's one to think about next time you watch Peter Pan. Another Disney example, it's a bit more directly involved with disability. Dumbo. I'm talking about the original version here. I'm not talking about the awful remake made last year. I'm talking about the classic original. That's more like a drama that depicts how an elephant with abnormally large ears rises through the ranks of being not mocked as a freak of nature to a global success. His name's Dumbo as a reference to dumb, and also his mother being called Mrs. Jumbo. I feel that kids need to see this because it's a common misrepresentation of what someone's really like based on what they look like. You see that the other elephants immediately respond in shock when they see Dumbo's abnormally large ears, and you have the crowd in the circus who absolutely ridicule him. I feel that Dumbo is a story that teaches children about disability, where it kind of depicts harsh realities while conveying that message of you can just use what you've got to your advantage and then you never know what might happen. Dumbo does eventually realise his potential with his ears. He learns to fly with the help of Timothy the Mouse. So I feel is really a good character who represents the good within society, who sees the positive aspects within people, because he stood by Dumbo the whole time that he does show that. And again, it's all about identity. Dumbo uses his ears as a form of his identity, and because he starts flying with them, it's something that I think is really crucial to that form of using disability as a form of success. So that's a really good message. I feel like with animation, it represents disability that's friendly enough for kids to enjoy and for adults to relate to in a very genuine way. Hunchback of Notre Dame's another good example. Let's move on. Next one. Comedy is an interesting one because I feel that this particular genre, it's a very, very delicate and a very, very sensitive way of representing disability, because it can go one or two ways. It can be hilarious in a very genuinely funny way, but it could also be offensive. And what I mean by offensive is that it could represent unfair stereotypes of disability. So that's why I feel there aren't that many comedies about physical disability. They might be interpreted in a twisted way, where they're directly addressed as a label, which I feel is wrong. Most comedy films focus on people with mental disabilities, where the disability is visible in some respect, even though you could argue it's invisible at the same time, where it's clear enough for people to notice quite easily. A good example, probably one of my favourite comedies, Dumb and Dumber, starring Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels. And the title in itself is a crack at representing disability in a funny way, where it's called Dumb and Dumber, referencing therefore those two characters. Lloyd in particular has clear developmental disabilities. However, I feel that the film doesn't deliberately stereotype the issue of developmental disabilities as someone to be ridiculed by, but I feel like his acts of stupidity and the slapstick humour is something that's represented in a funny way. You're laughing at him, but you're not laughing at him because of his disability. So therefore, I feel that the audience take enjoyment from an entertainment viewpoint rather than from a ridiculed one. It's very difficult, I feel, to get right in comedies, but when you do get it right, absolutely spot on. And Dumb and Dumber is a particularly good example. So let's move on to the next one. Drama films, I feel, are the most accurate representations of disability, in a sense of depicting the realities of living with a disability or around disability, while also showing the sense of morality, where they use that disability in a triumph over tragedy narrative. So in other words, the plot makes us look back on disability in order to make us move forwards of how to use that. So with dramas, depicting the lives of real people are a really effective way of conveying that message, not just in films, but in documentaries, TV programs, etc. And some particular examples that I did use as part of my studies years ago, My Left Foot and The Theory of Everything. They're both stories that depict two real people who have physical disabilities but use that sense of loss of their bodily functions and bodily control and use that to move forward and become a success. So these two people, Stephen Hawking and Christy Brown, sadly they've both passed away since, but they're both very, very inspiring figures in terms of disability, and both films, My Left Foot and The Theory of Everything, both completely justify what they went through and what they did to become a success that they have become. It's interesting because a lot of people recognise, particularly Stephen Hawking, as someone who's a scientist, but also I feel that people know him equally for his disability, because that image of Stephen Hawking in his wheelchair is just legendary. So it's another thing about a sense of identity. Yes, you've had that sense of loss, but also it's a sense of bringing something back. I think the way that dramas are handled by the industry after they've been released is quite interesting, because My Left Foot and The Theory of Everything are played by two able-bodied actors, Daniel Day-Lewis and Eddie Redmayne. And what's interesting is that because disability is something that is an experience for someone who is able-bodied and hasn't had that experience, it's a transformation for these actors to study the disability and go into the disability, if you will, where it's authentic, whether it's realistic. They had to research the disability and how to pull it off. It's almost like a skill, really. It's just absolutely incredible how they kind of pull off this skill to kind of make it look like it's actually the real person on the screen.
I love you, Eileen.
And I love you, Christy.
You know it's just acting, but there are times when you just forget. You forget that it's actually an actor on the screen. It's not just the makeup, and it's not just the costumes and the hair and all of that, but it's just how he comes across. And I think that's what's just really, really clever about how dramas depict an authentic representation of disability. And this will probably be a subject for another video, but I think because a lot of actors who are able-bodied, who play disabled characters, win Oscars because it is that kind of skill, and because Daniel Day-Lewis won an Oscar and Eddie Redmayne won an Oscar as well. So in my opinion, that speaks 1,000 volumes of how well films represent disability in a very genuine way. But I think it's difficult because at the same time dramas aren't going to exactly depict their perspective, because films are made to make it look empathetic, dramatic and very emotional. So it's more about how the film represents the accounts of their story. It's their way of contributing to raising disability awareness. Though it's up for debate whether or not to cast able-bodied actors as disabled characters, there's always going to be a story of disability, and raises the point that, as Stephen Hawking said in The Theory of Everything,
however bad life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. While there is life, there is hope.
So although dramas do not necessarily represent disability from an actual disabled point of view, it's the story and the meaningful idea behind it, turning a negative into a positive. If you haven't seen My Left Foot and if you haven't seen The Theory of Everything, I highly recommend them. So, next genre? Horror was probably the first genre that represented disability. Not necessarily directly addressed it, but in a very stereotypical way. So it established it in its very early years, particularly in the monster movie era, where the whole horror convention is to scare people. And I feel that with a lot of characters that you see in horror films, you see characters who have clear physical impairments or psychological issues are represented in a way that, as something abject, as something that's quite horrifying to look at and to relate to. Villains in horror films usually appear to have a physical impairment that represent a sense of disgust and abject. Their image and personal traits stand out as a total opposition to the usual and traditional, completely able-bodied heroes in the story. So I feel with horrors though that the image of a particular villain dismisses the entertainment value due to their freakish image. So for example, the James Whale horror classic Frankenstein. It tells the story of a scientist called Dr. Henry Frankenstein whose obsession with building his own human from body parts of various different deceased people becomes a reality. He uses the electricity to create the birth of this character in the famous line, "It's alive, it's alive."
It's alive, it's alive, it's alive!
It's alive, but is it successful? When the character is born, he's just merely known as the monster, therefore immediately separating himself from the norm within society. And it's his actions, and it's his body language, and it's even some of the sounds and dialogue that he comes out with that makes him seem abject and seem inferior and villainized. The obvious one is that the fact that his body is built from different organs, so it's a sense of physical defect. And as you might have seen from the film, that there was a scene in the lab where they had 2 jars of 2 brains, where there was the normal brain and there was the abnormal brain, and they picked the abnormal. So that was an adding factor to his disability in that respect, where they used the abnormal brain to meet the physical impairment of his body, and that's why he's just known as the monster, as someone who's very, very abject. And even aspects of his physical appearance as well, even with the human organs and even with the brain. He has the bolts in his neck, and even his eyes make him look dull as well. But he's just not functioning as a person. He's just being controlled, or can't comprehend what he's doing, therefore signalling a lack of body control and human interaction. And the thing is, I would even go as far as to suggest that the monster character shows signs of autism. It might sound far-fetched, and you might think, oh my gosh, really? But this is why I think this is the case. Because there's a particular moment when he's by the river and there's this little girl there who communicates with him with a bunch of flowers. And what I think is interesting is his response to it, because she gives him the flowers.
I can make a boat.
And she throws the flower in there, but without even comprehending the consequence of what would happen, he throws her into the river.
No, you're hurting me! No!
And therefore she drowns, and his response is he just makes abnormal sounds. So it's that lack of social interaction. You could actually say that the monster character is a good character study of autism. There aren't many books about it. I did write it in my bachelor's dissertation actually, but I still think it's something that can be explored in more detail. I think there's more autism representations in horror films actually, as far as social conventions are concerned anyway. If you agree with me or you don't agree with me, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I feel horror films though, they barely address disability at all, but more as a metaphoric code where it's more through image representation within that narrative. So moving on. Romance is a good one as well, because it's a bit like drama, really, where it's very delicate because it focuses primarily on relationships. It might be fair to say that there aren't many romantic stories about disabilities because they may not fall into those characteristics of the normal versions of romance. So from a romantic standpoint, disability in film is something that I think is something that can hold somebody back, where it can deteriorate your self-confidence and self-esteem. So looking at a few examples, I'll be addressing 1 or 2 ways of how this can work. One example I've got is a film called Freaks in 1932 by Todd Browning. It's about a troupe of real-life freak show performers who go across the country and do their specialty, if you want to call it that. When it was released originally, it was more like a horror film, but now I feel over time it's a certain type of romantic story, particularly through the subplot between Cleopatra and Hans. So Hans is a sideshow dwarf, and Cleopatra is a young woman who is pretty much after him for his money. So she uses that sense of her being bigger than him because of his disability as a way for her to take advantage, therefore using Hans's own emotions and his own insecurities against him. I think there's a scene in the film actually where Cleopatra and Hans are celebrating their wedding at the reception, and her plot is actually to poison him.
Big happy dreams come
So she's married him, she's got what she wanted, but she wants something else now. It's something that's quite horrifying to watch, but it's just the way that the representation of romance in that sense is quite warped, quite twisted. I would have been interested actually to find out what the actors in real life would have found of this film originally. Not just when it came out, but before they were cast and when they were approached. I might research that actually, and if anyone else has got behind the scenes information about Freaks, then let me know in the comments. I'd be definitely interested about that. But karma did come to bite her in the end though, Cleopatra. So she ended up a freak herself among them. So yeah, the first cinema karma. But despite the idea of romance demoralising or ridiculing the disabled, there are moments in cinema that do show a sense of romance that go beyond one's image or perception. So for example, The Elephant Man, directed by David Lynch, absolute classic, one of my favourite films of all time. It's absolutely outstanding. And there's a moment in the film where John meets Mrs. Kendall, who's a successful stage performer, where they exchange words about Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare.
Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray. Grant thou, let they turn to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
And while he's speaking those words, she's seeing past his disability, not as a person with physical deformities, but as a human being inside. She sees the Romeo within him. There's not a sense of genuine romantic or sexual chemistry between them, but I think because she sees past that, and because they use Romeo and Juliet as the example, she sees the man within him. He conveys the emotions and the aspect of Romeo, and that's why in the end she does actually call him Romeo.
Oh, Mr. Merrick, you're not an elephant man at all.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're Romeo.
So she sees past, beyond his deformities, into this man where he's genuine, he's intelligent, he's loving, he's kind, he's all those things, despite his physical deformities. I feel that romantic representations in cinema can be portrayed in a very negative way, a bit like in Freaks, but also in The Elephant Man, in a very genuine way as well, that they are still human, they are human beings who deserve that opportunity, who deserve that chance. So, next one. Science fiction and fantasy. A bit like action and adventure, this one. Because it's set in a fictional world, science fiction and fantasy, it's not necessarily addressing disability as disability, but the conventions of the genre can reflect disability as a metaphor within the story. A lot of science fiction and fantasy stories strongly rely on technology, not just within the budget of actually making the film, but within the stories themselves. It's usually set in the future. There are like loads of different characters, like monsters and robots and aliens and all those things, but also human beings who have other futuristic characteristics as well. A good example, and I'm so glad I'm talking about this, Darth Vader is a really good example of this, because as most of you probably know who've seen Star Wars, which is probably pretty much everybody, is that he wears a mask, he wears a mechanical suit, he breathes mechanically. In the originals, the first two originals, you don't see what he looks like, and at least at the time of when they were released, you don't know what's beyond the mask. You don't see that, as the prequels revealed, that he didn't lose an arm, he didn't lose both of his legs, and he was burnt to an absolute crisp. But after the episode 6, where they went into more detail about his background, so Darth Vader was the evil alias of Anakin Skywalker, who was a completely able-bodied Jedi Knight, at least until the end of episode 2, where he did lose his arm, therefore starting his physical journey into the Darth Vader mask, which he'd already shown previously, his first mental journey into the dark side when he was going to search for his mother, and it showed that he was once an able-bodied person, and that's someone who you can empathise with. How did he go from this cute and innocent little kid to this evil lord who's got pretty much no arms or legs, who struggled to breathe, and he had to put a mask on and a suit on to keep him alive. And that's what's interesting about that character. And I think that's why I think in terms of disability, he's a very complex character, because it doesn't just go from his character arc from good to bad until things change in episode 6. It goes from able-bodied and good to disabled and evil. So enough about Star Wars. I could talk about it all day. I'm not going to, because I'll bore you to death. So next one. War. I think with war films and injuries, I don't think it dehumanises soldiers as inferior compared to pure soldiers, but it just shows the reality of what they've gone through. I think the injuries and the physical disabilities show a lot more character. So the examples I've chosen are Born on the 4th of July in 1989 and Forrest Gump in 1994, particularly the latter, Forrest Gump. A particular character I'm going to talk about in that film is Lieutenant Dan. Originally, when we first meet him, he's just a normal, able-bodied lieutenant in the ranks of the American Army in the Vietnam War. He has his role to play, he has authority, but when they're ambushed and he's injured, which he wanted to stay in the battlefield.
I told you to leave me there, Gump! Forget about me! Get yourself out!
And to die nobly as a soldier, he was rescued. It came at the cost of him losing his legs. Because he'd lost his legs, he'd lost his dignity, he'd lost the sense of being a strong soldier to how he described it as
a legless freak!
Because Forrest saw something good in him as a person, that he could use that to his advantage. Dan didn't see that at the time.
What am I gonna do now?
Because he kind of spiraled downwards into this stereotypical image of war veterans who are disabled. He becomes an alcoholic as well. He feels like he's got nothing to live for, but then as the film goes on, he kind of reasserts that identity and he accepts who he is, and he's thankful that Forrest saved him. He uses that convention to become a better person because of what he'd gone through. I think because he reasserts a new life, not as a soldier, as a normal person, because he becomes a shrimp boat assistant, and more importantly, towards the end of the film, he arrives to Forrest and Jenny's wedding with a walking stick and metal legs with a fiancée.
Lieutenant Dan.
Hello, Forrest.
Like Forrest said,
You got new legs. New legs.
Yeah, I got new legs. Custom made.
I think what's interesting is because throughout the whole film, Forrest still calls him Lieutenant Dan. So because he still calls him that, it's something that I think is really important in asserting Dan's identity, that he's still that person, that the physical disability shouldn't change anything. And he may have perceived that, but in the end, it didn't, because he had a fiancée, he got his legs back to an extent, he had a clean shave and a haircut and all that stuff that represents the sense of cleanliness from the dark place that he was in. Injuries may weaken them physically or psychologically at the time, as Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump implied, but it also showed that you use that and things happen for a reason to change you as a person, and therefore you can reassert a whole new, different identity, hence why he did at the end of the film. So Forrest Gump, absolutely iconic film. Amazing performance by Gareth Sinise from Tom Hanks as well. So last but not least, last genre we're going to look at. Western. I feel with this particular genre there are the fewest representations of disability out of any other. I could only think of a few actually that do represent a sense of disability. Unlike most westerns, they're set in the wilderness, where the characters are like outlaws. Again, it overlaps with action and to a certain extent science fiction and war, but there are conventions of Western like hats, eye patches, horses, certain type of clothing, all those things that can convey the sense of disability. It's one example, but it's two films. So the example I've chosen is True Grit, the 1969 version starring John Wayne and the 2010 version starring Jeff Bridges. The character I'm talking about is Rooster Cogburn. He has a missing eye who wears an eye patch based on an injury he had during the American Civil War. I feel the meaning of this particular prop shows that he's wounded, but it also, because it's a Western convention of having an eye patch, it kind of shows that image of him being an anti-hero and a member of the law. I also think the outcast settings of the wilderness contributes to that as well, that he's isolated from the normal society. And again, like horror, I feel that westerns do depict a distinction between disability as villainy and disability as wounded and anti-hero. So it's that image and that sense, that plot device that determines the sense of building that character as a villain or as a anti-hero. I mean, Rooster may come across as a villain.
Help me!
I can do nothing for you, son.
But because of his unorthodox motives, he is loyal still to the American government, therefore still making him the protagonist of the story and the hero. And the title True Grit genuinely refers to Rooster in both his appearance and his personality.
They tell me you're a man with true grit.
But it's also a term that describes westerns and could be connected to disability. So as shown in this video, disability is represented in film genres in various different ways. There are some that I've kind of gone over a couple of times where I might have overlapped the genres and the examples a little bit, but the whole reason why I wanted to do this was because I wanted to show the conventions of the genres are relevant to the way that the characters are portrayed and the way disability is represented. So that's why I did the specific genres that I did. They can be portrayed one or two ways, in a stereotypical way, or it can be in a promotional way at the same time that raises a sense of awareness for audiences to comprehend and learn from. Although not all representations of disability are deliberate, but I just feel that because the representation of disability has broadened itself a lot more as films have gone on over the years, and I feel that the film industry is starting to encourage that. But also I think to address as well that, particularly through drama and through romance, that disability is not necessarily synonymous with disease, and you have that disability for a reason, that you can use that to your own advantage in a different and unique way. So speaking to everybody else generally, conditions can't be curable, but as the film examples have shown, they can be rehabilitated and used in a positive way. So a couple of questions for you. Have you got any favourite disabled characters? Let me know in the comments below what you think. And what do you think about how disability is represented in certain genres? This is a subject I love talking about all the time, and I'd love to know what other people think. So before you go any further, drop a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. See ya.